So I'm very happy to be here and to have a really privilege and fortune to have an opportunity to speak a little about some things that are really close to my heart. Before I do, I'd like to just invite you to take a moment to kind of land here with yourselves and your bodies in whatever way might be meaningful for you. It doesn't mean you have to be doing some kind of formal meditation practice, but it could mean that if that's something you like to do. But coming out of the many different layers and levels of activity and engagement that are here, and it can be sometimes useful to just allow ourselves to be in touch with our bodies, to feel, and I like to feel what it's like to sense the ground beneath me, the firmness of earth underneath feet and legs and body. And just notice what it's like to connect with that. And also to just acknowledge and sense the space around and above, the openness that's here that invites us to expand into it. And perhaps also just to acknowledge and to include a sense of our breathing, that rather natural process that sustains our life, that connects us to each other in the shared element of breath, that flows in and through our bodies and the bodies of our companions, our neighbours, and the community of living things that breathe, that partake in breath. And I just invite you in that, just noticing or connecting with this quality of earth and sky, of breath, of just being here, to also maybe take a moment to acknowledge or appreciate that this isn't something guaranteed or forever, but is something that we have access to, that's available at this time for us. And we don't know for how long. And having taken a few moments in this way just to settle, land, connect a little with yourself, and just a sense of being here as people are still arriving, just coming in. Can also, I'd just like to invite you to notice and become aware of the people who are nearby. It might be you're visually aware of them if your eyes are open, or just you have a sense of them. And if you like to, you might want to open your eyes and just have a little look around. See who's here. I get to look at you. If you don't look around, you're mostly looking at me, which I think I get a better deal. So, and just noticing that there's a group of people who've come along who are interested in, well, I'm assuming are interested in the topic of the evening. And I think that's a wonderful thing, that there are people like yourselves who are interested just to come and see, and whether you have some already knowledge and experience or understanding of the territory that the topic pointed to, or whether you're just really here to find out a little. Very welcome, and it's very fine that you come in whichever situation you come here. I entitled the talk for this evening, Love in the Time of Extinction. And when I say it's just a few words, it's kind of like the title, it seems, for a talk, and yet immediately for me it invites and engages a whole range of possible responses. What could that topic be about if you hadn't read the blurb, or even if you have? What might I or someone be interested in speaking about that would be summarized thus? And I don't know what brought you here to choose to come and listen. I am really happy for whatever it is that might have brought you here. But for myself, I wanted to speak in this way because it seems like, as a human community, and a community of people, many of whom, because I see amongst you many people I know, and it's lovely to see faces here that I've seen in other places and here before. To have the sense of a group of people where I am wanting to have a conversation, and yet to use the word extinction in a context of soft human life is something perhaps challenging. I don't know how many of you know about, and I imagine you do, but I don't know, and I can't presume how much everyone here might be aware of the situation of our human community, our living earth, in fact, in the light of climate destabilization and ecological degradation that's taking place in our world at this time. It's so nice to come to Buddhafield. It's so beautiful here. There's so much light and joy and love and blessedness. And so there's some part of me that resists saying, but actually, there's also something really serious happening here. I was really touched when the topic for this year, or the theme for this year's festival was announced. Evolution, was it extinction or evolution? Evolution or extinction, I can't remember which way round. But that sense of, we as a human community, we need to grow, we need to develop, we need to move beyond where we've got to so far, because where we've got to so far has led us into a trajectory that is deeply concerning. And that's kind of, to say it not mildly, but gently, perhaps one might say, to say it's deeply concerning. And Buddhist teachings and practice sometimes seem to have a sense of kind of introspective, inward orientation that they're focused around and organized around, and it's a really important and essential part of what spiritual practice and Buddhist teachings are concerned with. And yet, equally, it seems to me, any authentic spirituality and any religious practice or tradition or community that's engaged with spirituality in an authentic way is also and equally concerned with the well-being of life, of oneself, of others, of all that lives. Because deep and authentic spiritual understanding reveals to us that we are not separate from everything around us. We are connected to, we are supported by, we are nourished through and dependent upon this very world of earth and sky and air that we breathe, and each other equally. So there's something I notice in myself that's hesitant to say. And I guess you are aware of what I will say, but nonetheless I notice it's not easy for us to talk about things that are difficult. One of the fundamental elements of the Buddha's teachings that drew me to them some 30 years ago when I first became engaged in meditation practice, having kind of left somewhat the world of activism because of the amount of reactivity and anger in it, and feeling like, I'm not sure that works. I need to figure out some way to deal with these inner processes that are so destructive and corrosive, internally and collectively. And coming into Dharma practice in the sense of understanding and care and concern for life that had this more inner focus, as I said, but had with it also the sense of actually turning towards what's true and being willing to acknowledge and to name what the Buddha talked about, the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, of that which is hard to bear. And to contemplate the situation of our world at this time as hard to bear. We are in an emergency situation in which the continuance of life as we know it is not guaranteed. The continuance of our ecology, of the community of plants and animals and human beings too, is under threat. In such a way that the word and the language of extinction makes sense. And this is, at some level, shocking. When I was here last year, I think, if I remember correctly, I spoke on the topic of mortality. And the fact that for each of us as human beings, but especially and particularly as Dharma practitioners or followers of the Buddha's teachings, for those here who might hold themselves in that way, and it's not that you need to be so, that this kind of acknowledgement and contemplation of our own mortality is something that brings us into a more keen and close engagement with life. And we have to kind of hold and face the tenderness of what that means and the painfulness of what that means for ourselves and our loved ones, we might say. But it's another whole order of contemplation, of practice to allow ourselves to turn towards a circumstance and a reality and to contemplate this, in which it seems not just the mortality of individuals is to be contemplated, but in a way the ending of expressions and forms of life, in terms of species, in terms of habitats, in terms of ecosystems. And so, again, I imagine you know, but just to say, as it seems needs to be said, so that we can hear it and feel it. And the news has been sort of building over years, but clearly some critical point of information last year with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, supported and promoted by the UN, coming up with its report. Who here is familiar with that report? Okay, so we aren't all, and that's fine, but it's important that we know that it said that the trajectory of global climate destabilization, expressed particularly in terms of warming of the climate, is heading at the moment currently in a trajectory that will be completely devastating to our world. And we were given a very clear message by the combined scientific wisdom of our international community saying we need to turn this round very quickly. We have 12 years in which to do it before it will be too late. And for all the international agreements over the many years, Paris, Kyoto, going back through various accords, for all the talk that has come, it hasn't happened. In fact, the bottom line is that the global temperature continues to increase. Carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions are continuing to increase. And we as a human society have failed to respond to a situation we have created that we're aware of. And together with that, the report coming out this year from the IPBES, the United Nations panel reporting on biodiversity, species and habitats and ecosystems, very clearly naming and recognizing the acceleration of loss of species, of ecosystems, of habitats, that this process of life dying around us, not just individual life, but whole living families that cannot be replaced. This is the thing about extinction. With individuals, there is death and then there is birth. extinction means there is death and there is no further birth. Not in the kind of the transcendent Buddhist way of whatever that means, but in the actual, there's no more of these beings to be born. The conditions for that are gone. And the loss of that is profound. Such that there may be, at this time, 1 million species heading for extinction. And at one level that's just words, that's just information, but at another level it's so much more than that. And that's why I notice the sense of, what is it to turn towards this? To, as someone who's interested in life, be interested to take this in. It's not that it's somehow a trajectory that must play out in the worst possible scenarios, but that may well do. And particularly, it seems will without some shift within our collective human community. And so it seems to me it's natural, it's understandable that we would not really want to know that, or that knowing it, we wouldn't really want to feel what that means. We wouldn't want to let in what and how that might affect me or my life. Or so I just invite you to take a moment, again, just to take a moment to feel the earth beneath you, the space around you, whatever it might be that allows you just to sense and feel, okay, so what's it like to hear this? Because, as I said, I'm sure for some of you, you've heard this and reflected on it many times, and others of you, maybe not so much, or at all, I don't know. And for myself to just come back to this contemplation, just, oh my gosh, it's painful in all sorts of ways. It's kind of shocking, it's kind of confusing, it's kind of there can be so many responses. Skepticism or disbelief, horror, human activity, conscious activity that we know is doing this, is continuing. And so it's always kind of, I could say a lot more could be said, and maybe that's enough just to state for now. Does anyone have, and I'm really would like to invite, if you feel moved to respond with just a few words, that I'm really meaning a few words, of how that lands for you in terms of feeling life. Not why it is or what's to be done or what could or could not be done, but just what's it like to contemplate we're in a situation where our human activity in our particularly modern industrial technological society has created and is creating conditions that may lead to the destruction of our community. The reports that I describe are somewhat optimistic in certain ways because they have to be done in a conservative, collective agreement. Many of the reports, the individual research on which they're based, suggests much scarier outcomes than some of what's been made in the sort of the more public reports. And certainly the prospect of human extinction is included in that, and in one report, a 1 in 20 chance. Which sounds like that's not bad odds, if one was trying to win some, bag of fruit or something. But would we put our children on a plane, or our grandchildren, if we knew it had a 1 in 20 chance of coming down? Just no, we wouldn't, would we? And yet somehow collectively we're managing to do that. We're managing to put our grandchildren on a plane or a planet which has a 1 in 20 chance of being unable to sustain their lives. So again, I'm just naming this does anyone have a response or just a few words they might wish to say, to name how that lands for you to hear it said? And again, it might be anything, but just a few words. And it's okay if you don't, because it's a kind of maybe not an easy invitation in a situation where we don't know the people we're with so much necessarily. But if you wanted to, there's a space here, yeah.
It's not new news. I know what you're saying. But each time I hear it, it has the same profoundly terrifying body blow. And my gut terror is not for me, it's for my children and my potential grandchildren. And it's unbearable.
Yeah, and I think, thank you. And even having heard, if one lets the information in, it's like, oh, this isn't just information. And that it's terrifying and horrifying, or it's like, as you said, a body blow can be the feeling. It's like, whoa, we feel the weight and the power of this situation, the circumstance, yeah. Just at the back and then, yeah. Yes?
As you say the words, I'm really aware of all of this, and stuff to do with them, but I don't know, as you say the words, it's, I don't know, it's kind of like there's this disconnect there. I know it, but I can't quite
Yeah.
feel it. But then as I bring to mind more the kind of creatures, that's what it is. They're innocent, and we are, basically,
Right. Right. Yeah. So just so I can reflect, because not everyone will have heard, I think, that sense of kind of hearing it and kind of being familiar with it, and at one level not so much kind of feeling impacted by it until one starts to contemplate. There was a few pieces there. That sense of bringing in the fact that, oh, this is happening to, in a way, the innocent, whether it be innocent creatures who had nothing to do with it, or in a way the generations coming, who, of human generation too, had nothing to do with how this came to be. And there's something about responsibility and the weight of, of that. I'm sorry if I'm not exactly catching all of what you said there.
But I find it a bit more disconnected when it comes to people.
Yeah.
So I find it more easier to feel the pain and connect with the animals.
Yeah. Yeah. So the disconnect is more clear when contemplating human beings, but other beings, the feeling of the connect and the concern arises more clearly. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just echo what that lady said over there around the kind of body flow. But then adding on that I feel kind of really overwhelmed by the scale of it, to the extent I feel quite helpless as an individual. I mean, I can do, anything. Something's got to shift too much.
Yeah. So again, there's the impact and feeling of that, and then sometimes the response or the sense of that is a helplessness or a hopelessness. What can I do as an individual with the relatively limited power and capacity of one human being? And with that, then also the sense of need and wish, or recognizing the importance of something that needs to be more collective, or from a level that isn't just the individual. Yeah. Thank you. So yes, perhaps we'll just this one more.
I've been aware of these reports and this information, and it seemed like something that's going to happen, but it is happening. And right now, the entire state of Alaska is on fire, and that's where I come from. And all of the animals and all of the forests are burning, and there's drought. And my friends who rely on the fish are full of lice and parasites. So this is the extinction of species, the extinction of plants, and a very, very real threat to the livelihood of the communities in places that live in a subsistence lifestyle with the earth, in places like Alaska. I know there are fires in western Canada right now. It's happening now.
Yeah.
And for me, it's overwhelmingly sad and terrifying and frustrating. And you just feel, what can we do?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And again, I really appreciate your naming that sense that we sometimes think about this as something coming, but actually it is already happening, and it is tragic and terrifying and painful, and there may be those amongst us who have people and know people who are being directly affected already. And the trajectory that we're seeing described is that, in a way, this is just the beginning of a trajectory that will accelerate if it's not addressed. And so it seems to me any meaningful response in a situation such as this begins from allowing ourselves to be affected. That it's not about something that's happening in the future, because the effect of even knowing what is happening now and knowing right now what may happen in the future is actually happening right here. And as a practitioner of the Buddha's teachings of Dharma, of meditation practice, one's often invited and encouraged to kind of meet what's happening here. And some of what's happening here is my response and your response and many different responses of, it's like we want to respond. It's like this response that comes, if we allow ourselves to be touched and affected, the heart wants and needs, in fact, to respond. And then seeing, okay, what is possible here for us? And I have experienced much of the same frustration and fear and hopelessness, and at times, what can I do in contemplating and reflecting on this topic? And it's sometimes almost, and I've certainly felt in the past okay, we'll just sort of, we can turn away and make sure I take care of just my own heart to be able to handle the grief and the sorrow and the horror. And yet, there's another whole track that comes that is about, but actually, maybe we can respond in a different way. And so part of what I wanted to bring was, as well as just acknowledging the situation, is that I have for the last 9 months been engaged with a movement that has responded to the situation in a way that I have found inspiring and empowering and opening of my mind and my heart to what may be possible for myself and us collectively. And I think probably many of you will be aware of, and I know some of you are very aware of and involved with the movement Extinction Rebellion, and others of you will maybe have heard of it as this kind of bunch of random characters causing sort of relatively random forms of trouble in different places, and they maybe wondered what's going on there. And I've been surprised when I first encountered and read about this movement, how much it spoke to me, how much it, as a response to the threat of extinction, responding with, in a way, a statement of rebelling, of standing up and, in a way, stepping outside of the box in terms of responses, that for me presented something that seemed incredibly heartful and positive and hopeful, even in the face of the uncertainties of the situation. And so over the last 9 months I've been, and with others, many of whom I've discovered over the time also were involved in, engaged also with Buddhist practice and teaching, and also of course many who are not, but just in terms of the context here of what for many, or some at least, will be the framework, finding an incredible sense of compatibility and resonance and alignment with what was being invited and called for. So I'd like to speak about that in terms of how that works, what that looks like. And there's so much I want to say. So I'm just watching myself choosing which pieces, because unless you were staying here till long after, I think you would be able to. All of it won't be said just now. But maybe I can reflect on it this way. When we engage in inner practice and inner work, we learn what it is to actually align with what feels true and right and act from it, even though it may be challenging and difficult for us, because we understand, and I think this is what spiritual practice is about, it's understanding the deeper well-being that comes from being aligned to what feels true and what feels wholesome, despite the fact that that might cause difficulty for us in the outer circumstance of our life. And in a way, the theme or the topic of the talk this evening, love in the time of extinction, what does it mean to allow our love for ourselves, for each other, for life, for beings, for the world, and for the deeper potential and possibilities of the human spirit? What does it mean to allow our love for that to be the central and guiding principle in our responses to the circumstance of extreme danger that we are part of? What struck me about Extinction Rebellion when I first heard about it and started looking into and following and then engaging with the movement and the actions suggested within that, which were essentially stepping out of the paradigm of activism of what I've known before, of signing sort of petitions and going on marches and writing letters to the MP and, you know, all of that, which it seems can be ignored. The paradigm was actually causing disruption through civil disobedience as a way of getting the attention of both the public and the powers that be, the media, the government, that this seemed to me like, oh, this makes sense. I can understand how this would work. But the process of actually going into it has completely surprised me in how powerful it is, how beautiful it is. To act with others, with friends, together, to say, actually there's something more important than my convenience, my comfort, even my liberty. To say, in fact, I want to be able to look at my community of friends, of family, at the children who will come after us, and feel that the love I feel and have in my heart for these people, for this life, for this world, has been given the fullest expression it could. It's one of the delights of teaching or giving a talk here at Buddhafield is the children who come and join. Most times when I'm speaking, there aren't so many. And may the children always come to these talks, be my wish. To engage in non-violent civil disobedience is to find a voice that cannot be silenced or ignored. And I think a lot of the real pain and frustration for many deeply caring people, and I would imagine I can safely include all of who are here in this, is the sense that our concern has no pathway that can actually make a difference. And yet there is a remarkable history of people such as ourselves choosing to say at a certain point, in fact, what is happening is not acceptable. Something has to change, and this is the most important thing. And then finding ways to express that, finding ways to enact that, we could say. And it was a complete revelation to me. The first action I engaged in with Extinction Rebellion in November last year, some of you at least will have been aware of the occupation of 6 bridges in London, just a couple of weeks after the initial declaration of rebellion, and the sense of what it is for people to stand up and say, we're here to be noticed and to put a message out, and to be arrested and taken away, as many of us were, and to feel that this actually is allowing a message to be heard that cannot otherwise be heard. I was amazed at the number of conversations I had after that action with people wanting to talk to me about the fact that I'd been arrested, but actually about ending up having a conversation about climate and ecology and the danger of our circumstance that otherwise couldn't happen. Because there's something that happens for us when individuals choose to put themselves in danger or to take risks with their well-being or their privilege on behalf of the collective well-being. Not for personal gain or advantage or some kind of self-inflation, but because of caring and wishing that caring to be expressed. It's like, in our society, we really uphold that. We really validate that. I think of people who are working in the fire service, particularly clear example of that. Those people who go, into a burning building, and it's like to save life. It's like, wow, and we bow to them because they're taking a risk on behalf of everyone, not for their own gain. And there's something about that is remarkably powerful, and there is a history that shows that such ways of engaging can bring about social change in situations where it otherwise seemed impossible. And you'll be aware of the civil rights movement, I imagine, most of you. Maybe it's not all of the youngest ones. Civil rights movement in America, inspired by Rosa Parks and led by Martin Luther King, the non-violent civil disobedience, breaking the law in order to address something profoundly unjust, and the success that had in the face of oppression and repression. In India, under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, again, the independence movement that broke free from the colonial repression of the British Raj in that country, and non-violence that began with, in fact, the armies of the British forces using violence against them, and their willingness to just sit there and say, no, we will not resort ourselves to violence. My grandmother was one of the people involved in that. I'm 1/4 Bengali, and that's how she met my grandfather. So I'm only here because of that movement, it seems. And it faced down the greatest colonial power and one of the largest armies of the time. So it's powerful. There's a very clear capacity to make something happen that comes through this particular channel. And yet it's kind of hard to do creating disruption because nobody likes causing trouble for other people, and particularly in this country. In some other countries it might be easier to cause trouble for other people. It's kind of more allowed. I don't come from this country, but I've lived here 30 years now, so I'm from New Zealand originally, or somewhat originally. That's where I grew up. And it's really hard for us The journalists are really clear. If you cause disruption and trouble, get some people arrested, the newspapers will run stories about you for weeks. And it's true, they do. You can get 1 million people marching on the street, you get on the news today and you'll be forgotten tomorrow. But if you sit down and don't move, suddenly everything changes. And how does it change? Why does it change? Because it's threatening. Threatening not because it's aggressive, but because it's powerful. And how is it powerful? Why do we feel, so many of us, as I have, and some of you have named, that sense of frustration and helplessness? It's like our democratic system is no longer allowing the voice of individual people to really carry and drive the agenda. It's driven by money, and the concentrations and collections of money, vast amounts of financial capacity and resource, have the greatest force. And we see that. The fact that politicians need a lot of money to get elected makes them inevitably dependent upon and beholden to whoever can give them that money. And it's not me, and it's probably not you, but maybe it is, and if so, I'm happy for you. So I don't know who's here, but what happens when you engage in non-violent civil disobedience, if you're willing to walk out onto a street and sit down and stay there, is suddenly you engage with the economic system differently. Rather than just someone with a little bit of money or whatever we have facing groups who invested interests who have vast amounts of money. When you sit down on a road, you start to block transport and communications. Transport and communications is how money is made. The basic making money thing involves moving something that you can buy here cheaply to somewhere else where it's scarce and selling it for more money. Economic theory is a bit more complex than that, but that's a basic thing that happens. As soon as things stop moving, money starts not being made. And suddenly individual ordinary people have, in a way, muscle in relationship to where they often don't. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm simplifying, obviously, in the time frame. So that's one element of where it has power. The other element, as I said, is that in creating disruption, it generates a profile, it generates noticing. And part of what we're facing here is a failure of our community to actually allow itself to hear the information. It's like we kind of turn away from it because it's hard to hear the situation, the information. It's painful, it's scary, it's potentially overwhelming. And yet somehow when it engages us, and this is the interesting thing, that even people who are really angry and frustrated about having had their day disrupted, if the road is blocked, end up talking about and thinking about and reflecting upon why it is that happened. And it didn't happen just because some people sat down on a road, it happened because, they're concerned about this. And it's really interesting how people start to become aware of and think about a topic because someone's caused them trouble in relationship to it. It's quite the opposite of what we would normally think, as in don't irritate or annoy or upset anybody. Interestingly, spiritual practice and meditation practice specifically within that works in a similar way in that it disrupts our normal functioning and patterns and behaviour by setting certain boundaries. So I will sit here and not move on a cushion rather than on a road, but something there similar. It's like, that actually affects our internal processes and our ability to avoid certain things such that, and anyone who's practiced any degree of meditation will know this, you start to see and encounter things that somehow you'd managed to avoid really facing, even though you kind of knew they were there anyway. So part of how this, as I understand it, works, non-violent civil disobedience, works within the collective psyche, the social consciousness, in the same way meditation practice works within the individual consciousness. And the parallels are actually many. It's interesting that one of the things that happens in non-violent civil disobedience actually is just choosing to sit and stay there. Now, one doesn't have to be formally meditating to do that. One can just say, I'm just going to stay there. But that's the basic thing you do when you're meditating. Your mind might go all over the place, but I'll keep my body here. That's the basic foundation. And then see what else is possible. How's the volume? Do I need to speak louder? Can you hear all right? I'm just hearing the volume out there slowly increasing. Okay, good. So meditation practice has some primary components that equally are applicable and important in the process of non-violent civil disobedience that I just want to touch on and reflect on a little. Again, anyone who's engaged in meditation practice will know that the first thing that happens is you become aware of all these things that are difficult. And if you're like most people, you think of all the people who've caused all those things to me, and they're damned annoying, and we feel angry. A lot of anger with all the people, whether it be noisy people out there who are distracting, or my parents, or whoever knows what else. We start off, we end up angry with other people. Then, as we practice a bit more, we start to think, oh, actually, no, I'm doing this. We get angry with ourselves. We blame and judge ourselves. In the Stoic tradition, there's a kind of maxim which says, the unlearned blame others. Those who are learning blame themselves. And those who have learned blame no one. And it says, I think, very well, one of the, I think, fundamental learnings of meditation practice is we actually have to bring our hearts into this field in a non-judgmental, non-aggressive, non-violent way. Non-violent civil disobedience, in terms of inner practice, means actually bringing forgiveness and kindness to both those people who have caused us difficulty, but equally the way we ourselves have caused ourselves difficulty, or difficulty to others. And in this situation, and one of the principles of Extinction Rebellion that struck me when I first encountered it was this principle that says no blaming and shaming, that this is a systemic issue, and that any individual we might point to and say they're the bad person is simply an expression or a symptom of it. If they weren't there, someone else would be in that place, which is true. It's a systemic problem. And it makes no sense to judge individuals here. We need to see that actually something larger is needed. It also, part of what goes on, so there's often in activism a lot of anger that goes out towards the bad people who are doing the bad things. And it sometimes seems that people are quite callously, knowingly and uncaringly continuing to engage in actions that are destructive and harmful. And anger is an understandable response to that. But maybe not always a helpful one. If we become lost in and identified with it, what tends to happen also is and this is certainly the story of a lot of activism movements and groups I've seen and been involved with, that the anger continues to then play out against everyone else eventually in the movement, or anyone who disagrees with me, and equally towards oneself. Because if we look, we see there are ways which we ourselves are also involved, and we could say complicit in this. We ourselves are part of this because we too benefit from all of this. Maybe not as much as the CEO of an international or multinational petroleum conglomerate, but we still benefit in smaller ways. And when we judge and blame, if we blame the big bad guys for doing the big bad things, we also end up somehow feeling bad in an unhelpful way in ourselves for what we do that's not perfect. The culture of judging and blaming is toxic and unhelpful. To make a commitment to non-judgment, to be non-blaming, is about, okay, what is it to open my heart to the fact that we're all part of this, that no one chose it, but that we need, nonetheless, to find a response because we care, because of the love in our hearts, not because of the reactivity that engenders, understandable as it is. And so, in actions, this process of, and with Extinction Rebellion, the process of actually consciously opening our hearts in the situations that we found ourselves. Something remarkable and powerful that happens if one recognizes the tendency to get into a conflictual or a aggressive kind of response to the perceived problem or threat, and to turn into one's heart to see, can I find another way to meet this? Can I find another way to be in a situation such as this? And in the actions, again, that I'm imagining many of you will have been aware of in London in April, I was together with many wonderful other beings, part of the action on Waterloo Bridge. And one of the processes we noticed over the beginning as the police from quite early on tried to remove us from the bridge, that there's this kind of force being applied. And they call it the police force. And you feel that as suddenly, dozens and even hundreds of officers are coming, trying to remove people sitting peacefully. And that we talked about where that was happening as the front line. It was like this place of impact. And the sort of energy building, tending to build in the contact and the impact. And as we realised what was happening and started to talk about it, we realised, actually, we need to find some way to open and to soften, rather than to meet the force with a kind of an aggressive or a hardening, but actually to soften. To soften. We even changed the name, and it was a lovely little process where we kind of recognised, the front line, that's a military language metaphor, and we renamed it the heart line. Because it was like people sitting there in their hearts, taking a risk as vulnerable, soft human beings, making a sacrifice. And it's like, that was so helpful for remembering, I want to be here in the heart line, not the front line. And that vulnerability was really powerful. Really powerful. The police found it really difficult to deal with people because they're trained to deal with violence and aggression. And they even complained at times, they're really peaceful, so we can't send in the riot squad to beat them up and remove. They wouldn't have said beat them up, but to, physically subject them to pressure. It's like, there's a moral power also in that openness and that vulnerability. That's, again, something that happens in meditation practice, that anyone who's practiced some degree of meditation will be aware of what that's like, allowing oneself to be impacted by the forces internally and learning and practicing softening in response to that. And so we learn that we practice to soften, to open in response to the force coming towards us, to see, can we take that, and the police having been told to use the full force of the law by irate media commentators who they somehow feel they have to respond to. And it's interesting because there was even a statement in a piece in the news yesterday from the police, or maybe it was even this morning, where they were saying, we have to listen to the view of media commentators. I was thinking, do you? But anyway, they feel they do. And so this sense of, the full force of the law, and yet, we can actually absorb that. Because the practice in one of the beautiful, most touching times there in the process of being arrested, and some of us were arrested, several times, that sense of where we found this collective place together where we were really opening our hearts to the police and chanting. And I'm not much of a singer, as anyone who's ever heard me endeavour to chant will not just know, but probably have had to remind me, because I quite enjoy singing, but I just can't. But chanting, police, we love you. We're doing this for your children too. As they were arresting us and taking us away. And it was incredibly powerful to feel it was authentic. It wasn't just that's a nice line, but it felt like, we've actually learnt what this means in the course of the days here, in the face of that force. And that sense of practice is taking in a certain kind of force that's less wholesome and transforming it into something that actually then comes forward in something beautiful and something powerful. So that's kind of one of the elements of how I've come and I'm continuing to understand the practice of non-violent civil disobedience, of peaceful engagement with the forces and structures of our state, of our society, that are currently holding us in a framework that is needing to be opened up, to be challenged, in fact, because it's constraining our ability to do what needs to be done. If we are unwilling to step outside the boundaries of what we are told we must not do, and to always follow the injunctions of what we are told we must do, we have no freedom as human beings. And inner freedom and the practice of spiritual development is exactly the process where, as we learn to open our hearts, to not judge others, to not blame ourselves, to come from a place of kindness, and then we start to see and can start to meet from a place of clarity and kindness the internal patterns and injunctions that say you must not do that, even though you know this would be a wholesome thing to do. Or you must do that, even though you know it would be a harmful thing to do. And those ways in which inner development and process is about finding our freedom in recognizing those internal structures, patterns, and messages, and then consciously finding our way to slowly be able to no longer have our choices determined by them. So at an inner level, that's where we find freedom. To be free of the inner injunctions and compulsions. Collectively and socially, what it means is also stepping outside of that to say the fact that I am told I may not do this, in some circumstances, may need to be disregarded or consciously disobeyed. Or that it says I must do this and I say actually no, I will not. Born out of a conviction and a commitment to something more than just staying comfortable. Because for any of us, if we've done that inner practice, we know that holding our ground in relationship to the inner compulsions and injunctions is hard work. We don't always succeed, but it requires a real commitment, and it needs to be done with love. So too externally, so too as a collective communal response to a situation that is calling for, that is crying out for our human responses. We tend to think and feel in terms of our individuality in our culture because that's been the story that's been fed to us and that's been amplified and validated in the last 30, 40 years and more. But this is not something that can be resolved by all of us choosing to do things differently at a personal level. That's all important and great, but it's not enough. It actually needs a collective shift. It needs something that has to come from the level of where we've authorized collective process and decision making to happen, which is government, and which needs to operate in such a way that it also engages with and constrains the currently unrestrained power of we could say the corporate world that is invested in profit as opposed to human well-being. So maybe not all of the corporate world is such. I don't want to say that it is, I don't know at all. But so far as that's what it's invested in, that has to be addressed. Because at the moment, it is still the case that there is the potential for making vast amounts of money out of processes and products and extractive industries that are destroying the conditions for sustaining life on Earth. And what's interesting also engaging in non-violent civil disobedience is that it turned out, and this was remarkable, is meditation is wonderful training for it. Spiritual practice is great training for it. It's like, you know, sitting somewhere and not moving, you get uncomfortable after a while. If you've done meditation, you know how uncomfortable it gets. And you've chosen to stay there because you want to train your heart and mind in something that's more important to you than just feeling comfortable. And so, okay, so if you're sitting somewhere and you're attached to two of your friends and you can't move, not any longer your personal choice, you actually can't move anymore. It's like, oh, actually I know what it means to relax in this place where it's uncomfortable. To soften the place that goes, oh, bad idea, what did I do this for? And that. And you also feel your vulnerability. It's not about somehow being aggressive or tough. It's like, oh, it's a real vulnerability to give up one's choice to move. It's like, what if your nose is itchy and you're actually literally hands are attached to your friends? It's like, can someone itch my nose? You know, and the way this works, of course, you have someone there whose job is to give you a drink if you need a drink, or to some food, or to scratch your nose. And of course, they don't scratch the right part of your nose. It's like, no, over there, over there. And then, no, okay, can you stick something beside my nose so I can scratch it? And then it works. You learn how to do these things, how to take care of each other. Or in situations like that, where we feel ourselves reacting and starting to get angry. And like the training of practice to notice, okay, actually this isn't useful here. This isn't useful. But I need to find some way to express my concern. What can that be? What can that be? And so I was with a group of friends. In fact, Mark was one of them. We have a trial beginning on Wednesday. We were being prosecuted for an action we took in February in response to the petroleum industry's international conference happening in London. And 9 of us went down there early in the morning. And Serena's here as well. Sorry. Nice to see you. So this is the third of us who've been in this space. And we went and we glued ourselves to the doors. Now, the first time someone said to me, would you consider gluing yourself to a door? I thought, that's a really bad, I could feel I felt my hand. No way am I gluing myself to a door. And a couple of months after that first suggestion, I found myself there doing that with super glue. And it's really interesting. You glue yourself to a door and you're there. And 4 hours, your hand does not move. And it's kind of uncomfortable, it's painful. But it's sort of like, okay, can I just keep softening here? Can I keep opening to this? And at the same time, having the opportunity to say to these people going to this conference where they're basically, working out how they're going to exploit further fossil fuel reserves while presenting a really good public image of how they're now trying to protect against carbon emissions and climate change. And at the same time, lobbying and spending a lot of money to prevent any effective legislation to restrict their activities. And so there we are, a group of people, and just saying to them, think of our children, think of your children when you go into that conference. Like, think about what's happening here. This image is really interesting to me. I think I may have mentioned it in this space before. Have you ever seen an image of the Buddha doing something like this? Are you familiar with this image? It's called the Abaya Mudra, which is fearless, or I prefer to translate it courageous mudra. It's the soft part of the hand. It's not aggressive, but it's firm and it's strong. You want to try doing that, see what it feels like. Just make your hand firm, put it in front of your shoulder, somewhere out in front of you. Bring the fingers together, as if, not that I ever have, but as if you were going to do karate. Just boom, firm. What's it like? Anyone have a word or a response to noticing what's it like to put this up here? You'd have to glue it to something, just boom. So, louder, firm, strong, stop, resolute, determination, boundary, yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? It's a universal, the Buddha is sometimes seen in this posture, often standing. It's the fearless mudra. It's like saying, it's the expression of human compassion in its fierce form, or its courageous form, we could say, that says no to that which is harmful. And the Buddha spoke of this particular quality and capacity of human heart as something to be cultivated, as embodied in the situation of a parent who would be standing at the door of the room in which their small child is resting, and someone comes towards the room wishing to harm the child. And no way are you coming through that door. Nothing personal. I might still care about you as a human being, but there's no way you're coming in here to hurt my child. That particular quality embodies and expresses what, when it's not able to be handled and expressed in a helpful way, becomes our reaction of anger, of wanting to hurt and harm. But in its wholesome expression, it's protective and it's powerful. And this quality of whether or not one's actually literally in the mudra, as we were when we were glued. This is also the convenient way to glue yourself to something. You don't want to put it somewhere where your hand is going to get too uncomfortable, so you put it pretty much at shoulder height. If you put it up there, it's going to get really painful, so you don't. Or so I was told, fortunately, before I ever did it. It's not that I knew about that. The other way that it's sometimes done is like this. Now, we didn't do that. It's slightly harder to get into that position quickly and hold it. But this one, do you know this mudra? Anyone want to try this one? Do you know what it's like? If you just put your arm out at right angles and then hold the wrist firm and then just let it drop open. To attach it to something would require a little bit more bending, but just... Does anyone notice what that feels like? Do you have a sense of what it feels like in here, what it expresses? Receiving, giving, vulnerability, generosity, open, kind. Yeah, so this is actually the expression of metta, of loving kindness that the Buddha uses. The mudra of metta is this open, soft, sort of kindly giving and also receiving, I would say, quality. And they're very interesting together. When I do this one, I'm left-handed, so I tend to use this hand for it, though classically you'll see the Buddha use this one. But it's very interesting to hold them together. Anyone, just see what it's like. Sit into your seat, bringing the hand up and the hand open, and it's like, oh, it's really interesting. Bring the fingers together, let the body be upright. It's really interesting. What's it like to hold them together? Does anyone notice or have a sense of something they'd say? Balance. Heart? Safe. I didn't hear? Safe, yeah. Interesting.
It's a circuit.
It's also a circuit, yeah. Tough love, yeah. Empowered, yeah. Beautiful, thank you. Thank you. Tough love is a great concept to name and just hear. One of the ways that I find most useful to understand our situation is addiction. Like as a society, collectively, we're addicted to something that the doctors have told us is killing us, but we can't give it up. And it requires that disruptive, tough love to actually shake ourselves individually and collectively out of it. And it needs to be done with love, but also with that firmness and strength. So I'm aware I've been speaking for a while and I could keep going, but I'm not going to because I'd like to have a bit more just conversation. There's a couple of things I just want to add. First of all, personally, I'm willing to speak some about my own experience and trajectory. I have no basis for being able to say what you or anyone else should do. And so I'm not saying what I have chosen is what you should choose. And within Extinction Rebellion as a movement, there's a really clear wisdom around going slowly with finding what feels right for you and a recognition that there is a place for everyone, no matter what choice they might wish to make as to what feels appropriate. And I love the image of the firefighter. There might be some who will go into a burning building, but there's equally those people who actually have to drive the fire engine or have to fill in the forms in the back office to make sure that the uniforms with the particular protective equipment are ordered on time and available for the firefighters. And so there are many, many different tasks and functions that allow someone to choose to do a disruptive civil disobedience action. And all of those functions are valid and important and honourable expressions of one's engagement. So I just want to name that, hopefully, quite clearly there. I'm not sort of here advertising for a particular response, but I am really inviting and hoping that some of what might be coming from this is the sense of finding your response, whatever that might look like. And I have a friend whose sister is not so well and can't really leave the house, but she's really enjoying making artwork and posters to support this particular movement of Extinction Rebellion at the moment. And one might equally be supporting other movements that are engaged in good ways. I'd like to share with you a poem. just to come towards finishing. How are you doing? Your knees are probably sore, aren't they? We've been sitting here a while. If anyone needs to just take a moment to adjust your posture.
Getting cold.
And getting cold as well. Okay. I think the last time I did this, it was midday and it was hot. But, are you okay for a little bit longer? It won't be too much longer. So, Gail Bradbrook, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, in one of her talks, she reflected on the question, and I think invited as a really profound question for all of us to consider, what does it mean to be a good ancestor? What does it mean to have taken care of this world that we will pass on to those who come after us? And a friend of mine wrote this poem, which some of you again may have heard because it's been circulated. Following a conversation with myself and my partner Catherine about that phrase, a good ancestor. His name's Davrick Leggett, and his poem is called The Good Ancestor. He writes, "Every day I walk 100 years to the hill where my great-great-granddaughter sits. I carry words of blessing and reach to touch her back. But feeling me near, she turns, sad-eyed and heavy with grief. What was it like, she asks, when the great whales swam? When the birds sang you awake, when the rains came soft, and the soil smelled sweet underfoot, and the blessings catch in my throat. On darker days she turns, her famished face charred and eyes sunk in their bony orbits burn with curses. And the blessings froth at my mouth with the poisonous spume of betrayal. On the darkest of all days I walk the 100 years and find no one there. Let today be the bright day. Let today be the bright day. I lay my hand upon her back, and feeling me there she turns and blesses me, saying, your love was fierce enough, sweet ancestor. Your love was fierce enough. Every day I walk 100 years to the hill where my great-great-granddaughter sits. I carry words of blessing and reach to touch her back. Let today be the bright day. Let today be the bright day. I lay my hand upon her back, and feeling me there, she turns and blesses me, saying, your love was fierce enough, sweet ancestor. Your love was fierce enough. And really, we have the love that's needed here in our hearts. And we can come together to find our shared power in the softness and the vulnerability of our humanity, in its courage and its beauty. It is clear that we can change what happens here. We cannot guarantee outcomes. We do not know what will happen. But that so far as we turn and engage and do whatever we can, whatever we find makes sense, whatever we find is possible, there's also something of a turning in the realm of the spirit, in which ultimately the dangers that are faced in terms of the world and of life are equally the dangers of the heart, of the spirit, in which if we fail to do what we can, there will be the deeper injury. Martin Luther King said, never be afraid to do what is right. The punishments of society are small in comparison to the injury we do to our soul when we look away.